Since Descartes can doubt that he has a body, but he cannot doubt that he has a mind, it's conceivable that he exists as a mind without a body. This is going to start the separation that he needs to claim substance dualism, that there are two kinds of substances. Now, in the readings you get a discussion in places of identity, non-identity, and distinctness. Now, at this point in Descartes, he's established something that mind and body are not identical. But in order to claim that mind and body are two different substances, he needs more than that. And so, one issue we have is that, well, if the mind has some property that body does not, say the inability to be doubted, well, then it's not identical to body. If we want to check for identity, we take two things or two supposed things, make a list of all their properties, then compare those lists. If we find that, well, they share all of their properties in common, there's not really two things at all, rather there's one thing. It's identical to itself. Only things can be identical to themselves. No two things can be identical. If they're really two things, one of them has some property, the other does not. Mind has some property that body does not, the inability to be doubted. It also has these other properties. We'll get to that in a minute. So he can establish that mind and body are not identical, but he needs more than that. He needs to establish that mind is a mental thing and body is a physical thing are distinct. To say that two things are not identical is not to say that they are distinct. An example will be helpful. If you consider the land mass of the United States and the land mass of South Carolina, well, those land masses are not identical because there's some land mass had by the United States not had by South Carolina. South Carolina land mass, United States land mass, not identical. Nonetheless, there is some land mass that they share in common, namely the land mass of South Carolina. They're not identical, they're not distinct because they do share something in common. Alternatively, the landmass of South Carolina, the landmass of North Carolina, they do not share any landmass. Therefore, those two landmasses are distinct from one another. They do not share any properties in common. Now, it seems that mind and body do share certain properties in common. Say, if I'm subject to a trauma, that trauma could affect both my mind and my body. Therefore, my mind and body share some property in common, namely being affected by the trauma. However, we can get rid of this consideration if we separate out what we take to be accidental properties and essential properties. If we can make a list of the essential properties of the physical, the essential properties of the mental, it may be the case that we find that the things that are shared by my mind and body are mere accidents and not essential to my mind as a mental thing and my body as a physical thing. Here we get Descartes establishing, well, there are certain properties had essentially by their very nature, by physical things and by mental things. You could not have a mental thing without certain properties. They're essential properties. The essential properties of a mental thing, mental substance, is that it is immaterial, it has no mass, it's not extended in space, and it is by its very nature a thinking thing. On the other hand, physical substance has certain essential properties. Those essential properties are that they are material, they have mass, they are extended in space, and they are non-thinking. We might be a little concerned with how we establish a property as essential and how we establish a property, or then establish that we have exhausted all the essential properties of something. For something to be an essential property is to say that we cannot conceive of it without that property. We cannot conceive of a mental thing without it being a thinking thing or involving thought in some way. We cannot conceive of a mental thing as being extended in space. Similarly, we cannot conceive of a physical thing without it being extended in space, or as it being thinking. We do not think of the table as thinking. Now, if these claims are right, right, then the list of essential properties of the physical and the essential properties of the mental, they share no properties in common. They are distinct from one another. Therefore, there are two kinds of substances. They are distinct substances. Physical, mental. The mind is mental. The body is physical. Now, when he says that I conceive of the mind as existing without the body, and I conceive of myself as a mental thing, now we've got a real separation between mind on one hand and body on the other hand. Now this causes a very big problem. If mind and body are distinct, how can they interact? And this is the problem, the biggest problem that faces substance dualists, mind-body dualists that are substance dualists. How can two distinct things interact? Or, to put it differently, how could there be mental causation? How could an immaterial thing interact with a material thing? All examples of physical causation involve mass on mass, or so the claim is at the time. Something that's immaterial could not cause a change in something material. So Descartes faces the causal interaction problem. He anticipated this, he saw this, he played some hand-waving at the problem. He gives something of an account of how this interaction occurs by sort of locating it at a place in the body. That actually does not work, because just to say that it happens at a place does not say how the physical could interact with the mental. Now, the other readings sort of expand on issues found in Descartes. Plantinga picks up on Descartes and he says, well, if we grant Descartes his argument, Descartes says that he could conceive of himself as a mental thing without a body. The thing that is Descartes is just a mental thing. It happens, as a matter of fact, to have a body. Descartes does rebuild his confidence in the belief that he has a body. In order to do this, he actually takes a turn to granting that God exists. God exists with a certain nature, and God would not allow him to be deceived, or rather God has given him a method for checking to see whether he's deceived by comparing all of his senses, checking his memory, and so on. Therefore, he has confidence that he does actually have a body. Nonetheless, the body does deceive at times because of its nature. Nonetheless, the claim of Descartes is that he is essentially a mental thing, and by chance in this world happens to have a physical body. It could be the case that he were only a mental thing without a physical body, because the fact that he has a physical body is an accident, not essential to his being a thinking thing. Plantinga says, well, let's consider, could Socrates be an alligator? Well, it depends on how we understand that question. If by alligator we mean a physical body, well, it is the case that Socrates could have an alligator body. However, if we grant Descartes his argument, Socrates is by his nature a thinking thing, and therefore he could not be an alligator body if alligator body is understood as a physical thing. No person as a thinking thing could be a physical thing. So not only is it the case at the end there that Socrates could not be an alligator, if by alligator we mean an alligator body, Socrates as a thinking thing could not be Socrates, if by Socrates we mean the body that was actually owned by Socrates. Socrates is a thinking thing. That's independent of body. As being a thinking thing with certain essential properties not had by physical things, no person as a thinking thing could be a body. They could, by chance, have a body, but not be that body. Now, in the final reading for the week, we see a move made to property dualism. So here we have substance dualism. There are two kinds of substances. Property dualism, on the other hand, says there's only one kind of substance. It is a monism. That substance is a physical substance. However, the physical substance of the body has two different kinds of properties, has physical properties and has mental properties. When we get bodies that are significantly complex in their construction and put together in a certain way, we have an emergence of a new kind of property, the property of mental activity, mental processes. We have a mind. This is not to say that this mind is essentially immaterial, unextended, and thinking as a substance. The properties may have those properties themselves, but the only kind of substance that exists is a physical substance. Now, going back to considerations of identity, non-identity, how are we not here just saying that the mind is identical to the body? Well, because there are bodies without minds, but more so there are some properties had by the mind, not had by the body, so claim property dualists. And one of these is intentionality. That is, when I have a thought, it's directed at something. If I think that this video is getting very long, my thought is about the video and the length of the video. Whereas, when I have that thought, certain things happen in my body. There are changes in my brain, chemical changes, certain firings of neurons. Those things, as physical activities, physical properties, are not about the video or the video's length. If this is true, then there exists some property of mental activities not had by physical activities, and therefore mental properties are not the same as physical properties. Now from this we get all kinds of things that follow. If we could give an exhausted list of all the physical properties of me at a given time, there's still things true of me that have not been said, namely the mental things about me. Now this has huge implications. Positive of this is that we get around, potentially, the causal interaction problem. Since mind and body are not essentially two different substances, rather every mental event is somehow connected to a physical event, then I can understand how causation works. There's a certain physical state of my brain, of my body. It leads to a different physical state of my brain, of my body, and that causes changes not only in the brain and body, but changes in my mental experience. Since the cause is from body to body, with something like a side effect of a mental change, now I can give a causal explanation in the way that we're used to. What's going on here is to say that the mental supervenes on the physical. Now, supervenience, words you may not know. To say that the mental supervenes on the physical is to say that there cannot be a change in the mental without a corresponding change in the physical. This is a directional claim. There could be a change in the physical without a corresponding change in the mental. Say some skin cells flake off my body. That does not register to me mentally at all. Physical changes do not need to lead to mental changes. Anytime there's a mental change, there is a corresponding physical change. If all of our causation is understood as physical causation, I can still explain, potentially, mental changes, mental activity by explaining physical changes, physical activity. However, we may not be able to do this to the full extent. Another huge implication of property dualism is the claim that, well, mental properties emerge from a complex physical organization. I could give an exhausted account of all physical properties of me and leave something out, the mental properties of me. So we could have a completed physical science that still does not fully explain the mental.